In the spring of 1776, a small American squadron left the eastern coast of North America and set course for the Bahamas. Its target was the British town of Nassau on the island of New Providence. At first glance, this looked like an ordinary raid for military supplies, but this expedition would become the first naval operation ever officially authorized by the Continental Congress. This is where American Marines would make their first amphibious landing on enemy shores, and the young Continental Navy would carry out its first independent combat operation. Here's the truly remarkable part. The signing of the Declaration of Independence was still almost 4 months away. The United States did not yet exist as a nation, but its future Navy and future Marine Corps had already set out on their first war. This story didn't begin in the Bahamas. It began thousands of kilometers to the north, near Boston. By early 1776, the War for Independence had been raging for almost a year. After the opening clashes at Lexington and Concord, the colonists had managed to form a Continental Army placed under the command of George Washington. But it quickly became clear that determination alone wasn't enough. The army was short on literally everything. Short on money, short on uniforms, short on weapons. But the most dangerous shortage of all was gunpowder. Without it, muskets became nothing more than useless sticks, and artillery turned into heavy metal decorations bolted to the walls of forts. Washington wrote to the Continental Congress almost constantly, and in his letters, he wasn't asking for new victories. He was asking for powder. Sometimes the situation got so dire that officers had to forbid their men from firing at will. Every single charge had to be conserved. According to contemporary accounts, on certain days supplies were so low that the army could barely have sustained one serious engagement. Had the British launched a major offensive at that moment, the consequences could have been catastrophic. The revolution might have ended before it had truly begun. So for the Americans, securing military supplies became a matter of survival. And as fate would have it, the British themselves gave away exactly where to look. Back in 1775, Virginia's royal governor, Lord Dunmore, understood that arms depots could fall into rebel hands. To prevent that, he ordered a large quantity of gunpowder and weapons shipped to the Bahamas, to Nassau, capital of the British colony of New Providence. The decision seemed perfectly logical. The island sat far from the theater of war, and the colonists had virtually no navy to speak of. No one seriously imagined the rebels would dare cross an ocean to attack British territory. Yet British command did consider the possibility. In August 1775, General Thomas Gage, Commander-in-Chief of British forces in North America, sent a warning to Montfort Brown, Governor of the Bahamas. He advised reinforcing the island's defenses, since its depots could become an American target. That warning would prove prophetic. By early 1776, the gunpowder shortage had reached a breaking point. The Continental Congress could wait no longer. The decision was made to launch the first naval expedition. Command was given to Essex Hopkins, a seasoned Rhode Island sailor. Officially, his orders were to clear the coasts of Virginia and the Carolinas of British ships supporting the Crown's forces. But there were also secret instructions. On February 17, 1776, as the ships gathered off Cape Henlopen at the mouth of Delaware Bay, the captains opened sealed orders. For the first time, the true objective of the expedition was revealed. The Bahamas, Nassau, the gunpowder depots. For Hopkins, this was no ordinary expedition. It was a chance to prove the Continental Navy could do more than defend its own coastline, that it could carry the war onto enemy territory. The flotilla tasked with this mission was small. It consisted of 8 ships: Alfred, Columbus, Andrew Doria, Cabot, Providence, Hornet, Wasp, and Fly. Compared to the squadrons of the Royal Navy, this was a modest force. Most of these vessels had until recently been ordinary merchant ships, hastily fitted with guns and converted for military service. On board were roughly 1,000 men. Among them, about 200 Marines, under the command of Captain Samuel Nicholas. The Marine Corps had been founded only a few months earlier. These men were about to become the first American Marines ever to go into battle. They had no idea that one day their names would be remembered as the founders of a tradition that would outlast centuries. Among the young officers of the expedition was a man whose name would later become a legend of the American Navy: Lieutenant John Paul Jones. In mid-February, the squadron left Delaware behind. Ahead lay nearly 2,000 kilometers of open ocean. But the Americans' first opponent turned out not to be the British at all. Almost as soon as they put out to sea, the ships ran into a fierce winter storm. Massive waves scattered the squadron. Communication between the ships broke down. Hornet suffered serious damage and was forced to turn back. Fly vanished from sight entirely. For several days, no one knew whether she had survived. Only later would the ship make her own way to the Bahamas and rejoin the expedition. For the young American squadron, this was its first real test. It hadn't even encountered the enemy yet, and it was already taking losses. Even so, Hopkins did not waver. He understood the storm was hampering more than just the Americans. British ships were also sheltering in port, waiting out the bad weather. That gave him a rare opportunity to strike before the enemy could prepare. A few weeks later, the lookouts finally sighted land. The Bahamas rose on the horizon. After the cold Atlantic, the sailors found calm turquoise waters, white sand beaches, and green palms stretched out before them. But no one was admiring the scenery. Somewhere ahead lay the gunpowder depots, the very powder George Washington was waiting for so desperately. Hopkins understood he had almost no time to spare. The longer the squadron lingered off the Bahamas, the greater the risk that the British would discover their presence or manage to move the supplies elsewhere. The success of the entire operation hinged less on firepower than on speed. Before closing in on Nassau, the Americans began intercepting small vessels traveling between the islands. They soon managed to capture 2 British sloops. Their crews were taken prisoner, and the vessels themselves were immediately folded into the Continental Navy. At first glance, these looked like minor prizes, but they were about to play a crucial role in the operation ahead. Hopkins's original plan was bold. The main squadron would stay outside the harbor, avoiding unwanted attention. Meanwhile, the captured sloops, disguised as ordinary merchant vessels, would slip quietly into port. On board were Samuel Nicholas's Marines and armed sailors. Before dawn, they intended to land right by the town, seize the forts in a rapid strike, take the arsenals, and give the British no time to resist and no chance to destroy or remove the gunpowder. The entire operation rested on the element of surprise, meant to offset the young American squadron's inexperience and the British Empire's overwhelming dominance at sea. But war rarely follows the script written for it. At dawn on March 3rd, the American ships closed in on New Providence. That was exactly when things began to unravel. Several local vessels spotted the unfamiliar squadron before it could even maneuver into position. Almost immediately, the silhouettes of large ships became visible from shore. The alarm spread through Nassau fast. Governor Montfort Brown was woken before sunrise. Without wasting a moment, he ordered the garrison roused and the fortifications brought to readiness. 4 warning shots rang out from Fort Nassau. Ironically, 2 of the old cannons couldn't withstand their own recoil and tore loose from their carriages. But they'd done their job. The roar of gunfire carried across the whole town, and the element of surprise was gone. For Hopkins, this was a serious blow. Had he pressed ahead with the original attack, the landing party would have come under fire from the fortifications before they even reached shore. The young American Navy risked suffering a defeat in its very first major operation. The Commodore refused to act rashly and ordered the squadron to pull back. From the shore, it might have looked like the Americans had abandoned the operation. In reality, the most critical part of the entire expedition was only just beginning. The ships withdrew roughly 6 miles east of the town and dropped anchor in Hanover Sound. Aboard the flagship Alfred, Hopkins gathered his captains for a council of war. Everyone understood the obvious. The original plan was no longer viable, and a new approach was needed. After brief discussion, they decided to change the landing site. The Marines would now go ashore southeast of the town, near Fort Montague. From there, they could advance overland, bypassing Nassau's main fortifications. Exactly who proposed this plan remains a matter of debate among historians to this day. Some credit the initiative to a young John Paul Jones. Others believe the decisive role was played by Lieutenant Thomas Weaver, who knew the local waters well. Whoever it was, this decision saved the expedition. Around noon, 3 American ships slowly closed in on the new landing site. Under cover from the sloop Wasp, landing boats began going into the water. Aboard them were roughly 200 of Captain Samuel Nicholas's Marines, with another 50 armed sailors set to reinforce the landing once ashore. For most of these men, this was all entirely new. The American Marine Corps had existed for only a few months at this point. There were no manuals on amphibious operations, no accumulated experience, no established tactics. Every step they took was, in effect, becoming part of future military history. The boats crept toward the shore as the Marines silently checked the flints on their muskets. Some adjusted their cartridge pouches, others gripped their weapons tighter. No one knew whether the British would open fire in the next minute. When the first boats touched the sandy beach, the Marines leapt into the water, weapons held high overhead. They formed up right there on the beach, taking up their assigned positions. But no British volley ever came. The landing went almost entirely unopposed. And so, on March 3, 1776, the first organized amphibious landing in the history of the United States Marine Corps took place. None of the men involved were thinking about the future in that moment. To them, it was just another military task. But that day would later become one of the most important dates in the history of the American Marine Corps. While the Americans secured their position on the beach, Fort Montague watched the whole thing unfold. Lieutenant Burke, commanding the garrison, quickly realized his small detachment had no chance of stopping the landing. Rather than fight a pointless battle, he sent a parley officer to the Americans under a white flag. The question was simple. What were their intentions? The answer came without hesitation. The Americans had come for British military supplies. They had no intention of harming the people of Nassau, so long as they offered no resistance. These weren't just empty words either. Before the operation even began, Hopkins had prepared statements addressed to the island's population, explaining that the expedition targeted British military assets, not civilians. For the 18th century, this approach was unusual. The Continental Congress was eager to show it was fighting British authority, not the colonial population itself. A calculation that was political as much as it was military. Meanwhile, Governor Montfort Brown had scraped together about 80 militia and rushed to Fort Montague. But what he found there quickly crushed any hope of mounting a real defense. Hundreds of armed Americans were already on the beach, backed by the ship's guns offshore. A handful of shots from the fort amounted to little more than symbolic resistance, rather than a genuine attempt to stop the enemy. Most of the militiamen could see the odds were hopeless and began drifting back to their homes one by one. Before long, the governor ordered the fort abandoned. Within minutes, Samuel Nicholas's Marines had taken Fort Montague with virtually no fight at all. The first landing was a success. But the real prize of the expedition was still sitting in Nassau, and it was here that Hopkins would make the mistake that would remain the most controversial moment of his entire career. Having taken Fort Montague, the Americans had what they'd come ashore for in their grasp. The road to Nassau lay practically wide open before them. The town wasn't far off now. The garrison was demoralized, the militia was scattering home fast, and British defenses were falling apart in real time. The obvious next move seemed to be an immediate march on the town. But it was right at this moment that something happened which is still debated by historians 2.5 centuries later. Instead of pressing his advantage, Hopkins ordered a halt. Nicholas's Marines stayed put at Fort Montague until the following morning. Why he made that call is genuinely unclear. Some researchers think Hopkins feared street fighting and didn't want to lead his men into an unfamiliar town without reconnaissance first. Others suggest he was waiting for the rest of his units to catch up and wanted to keep formation before any assault. There's also a theory that the commander simply underestimated how quickly the British could respond. Whatever the real reason, the consequences were plain to see. That pause handed the British several precious hours, exactly the hours they so desperately needed. That same evening, Governor Montfort Brown convened an emergency war council. The situation was painfully clear. Holding Nassau was no longer possible. The Americans controlled the eastern approaches to town, and the garrison was far too small to mount a real defense. But the governor wasn't ready to call it a total loss. If the town couldn't be saved, maybe the thing the enemy had actually come for could be: the gunpowder. As darkness fell, carts began moving through the streets of Nassau. Under armed guard, workers hauled heavy barrels from the depots down to the docks, racing against the clock. Every lost minute risked British strategic stores. Barrel after barrel went aboard the Mississippi Packet and HMS St. John. By midnight, they'd managed to load 162 of the 200 barrels of powder. That was almost the entire main objective of the American expedition. Around 2 in the morning, the ships slipped quietly out of the harbor, bound for British St. Augustine in Florida, where the precious cargo would sit safely out of the Continental Navy's reach. Here's the truly remarkable part. Stopping them would have been entirely possible. The Americans didn't even need to fight. Posting just a single ship at the harbor mouth would have done it. But that was never done. Why not? There's still no clear answer. Maybe Hopkins was confident the British wouldn't risk a night departure. Maybe he simply never imagined the governor would attempt such a swift evacuation. Or maybe, in the chaos of preparing for the assault, the question just slipped through the cracks. Whatever the reason, this mistake would become the central argument used by every future critic of the Commodore. After all, the expedition had set out chiefly for the gunpowder, and it was the powder itself that slipped right out from under the Americans' noses. On the morning of March 4th, the Marines formed up into a column once more. This time, no fortifications and no organized defense stood in their way. As Samuel Nicholas's men advanced on Nassau, the town offered essentially no resistance. Local officials came out to meet the Americans and handed over the keys to the town. And so, for the first time, the capital of a British colony fell under American control, virtually without a single shot fired. To the people of Nassau, the whole thing felt strange. Just the day before, they'd received Hopkins's statements, promising no harm would come to civilians if there was no resistance. Those promises were kept. Strict discipline was maintained throughout the town. There was no mass looting, none of the senseless violence that so often accompanied 18th century warfare. For the Continental Congress, this mattered enormously. The Americans wanted to make clear they were at war with the military authority of the British Empire, not with the people of its colonies, a calculation that was as much political as it was military. Governor Montfort Brown was taken prisoner along with several British officials. He was later exchanged for an American officer, but once back in Great Britain, he still had to answer to his own superiors, many of whom felt he'd surrendered the island too easily. It's hard, though, to imagine what other decision could have changed the outcome. The small garrison had neither enough men nor heavy artillery to stand against the American squadron. Even if the defense had held out longer, the result would most likely have been the same. Only the cost would have been far higher. Though the expedition's main objective had slipped away, the Americans still walked off with genuinely valuable spoils. Over the next 2 weeks, the sailors thoroughly combed through British depots, forts, and arsenals. What they found exceeded most expectations. Artillery began going aboard the ships. One by one, heavy guns were hauled from the forts down to the docks. In total, the Americans carried off 88 cannons and 15 mortars, along with thousands of cannonballs, muskets, ammunition stores, engineering tools, rigging, canvas, and a huge quantity of military equipment. To a modern army, a haul like that might look unremarkable, but to the Continental Army, which had until very recently been short on practically every single piece of ordnance, it was worth a fortune. Much of this weaponry would later be placed at George Washington's disposal and help strengthen his army's fighting capacity. So it would be a mistake to write off the Nassau raid as a failure. Yes, the Americans lost nearly all the gunpowder, but they gained something else the young army desperately needed too. And most importantly, they gained experience, the kind that no drill or Continental Congress meeting could ever have taught them. For the first time, they'd proven they could plan and carry out complex naval operations far from their own shores. But one more test still lay ahead. It was on the journey home that the young Continental Navy would come face to face for the first time with an actual Royal Navy warship. And that encounter would prove to be every bit as important as the landing at Nassau itself. The American squadron didn't actually leave Nassau until 2 weeks later. In that time, the ships took aboard everything worth carrying off: artillery, ammunition, tools, canvas, and a host of other supplies. Every extra day in the harbor raised the risk of British warships showing up, so further delay was becoming dangerous. The order was given, and the anchors came up. One by one, the Continental Navy's ships cleared the bay and turned north. The expedition was heading home. On the surface, things looked good. Nassau had been taken, valuable spoils sat in the holds, and the governor of the Bahamas was a prisoner. Even the loss of most of the gunpowder didn't look like a disaster against the backdrop of overall success. It seemed like the hardest part was behind them. But the sea rarely lets anyone walk away without one final test. During the return voyage, the Americans kept up the pressure. The Continental Navy still couldn't challenge British naval dominance outright, but it was already capable of landing painful blows on the enemy's supply network. Several merchant vessels became fresh American prizes, among them the schooner Hawk and the brig Bolton, both carrying cargo bound for British forces. Captures like these couldn't single-handedly change the course of the war, but each one brought the rebels supplies they badly needed while weakening the enemy at the same time. Bit by bit, American sailors were mastering a form of warfare that would remain their chief advantage for a long time to come. Striking at the enemy's communications and supply lines. At dawn on April 6th, a lookout aboard one of the ships spotted a single sail. At first, no one expected real trouble. The American squadron badly outnumbered whatever this unknown vessel turned out to be, and it looked like just another British transport about to become a fresh prize. But as the distance closed, it became clear this was no defenseless merchantman. It was the 20-gun warship HMS Glasgow, commanded by Captain Tyringham Howe, a seasoned Royal Navy officer. Unlike most of the American captains, he'd spent years serving in one of the world's most powerful naval forces. Now he was about to face off against a young navy still learning how to fight. At first glance, the advantage seemed to rest with the Americans, several armed ships against a single British frigate. But naval battles are rarely won by whoever has more guns. They're won by whoever knows how to use them better. That difference would become obvious very quickly. Once the ships opened fire, it became clear the American squadron was still lacking the one thing that mattered most: experience fighting together. The ships maneuvered with no coordination at all. Some captains pushed to close in and engage at point-blank range, while others tried to hold their distance. Signals from the flagship weren't always read the same way twice, and at times the ships actually got in each other's way while trying to fire. More than once, captains had to change course just to avoid colliding with each other, or catching fire meant for the enemy. For the British captain, mistakes like these were a gift. Tyringham Howe seized every opening instantly. His ship kept shifting course, working the winds to his best advantage, and landing precise hits on the most vulnerable American vessels. This was the Royal Navy's training showing, a navy that had dominated the seas for decades. Despite their numbers, the Americans never managed to surround the Glasgow. The battle dragged on for hours. The roar of cannon fire never let up, as round after round tore through wooden hulls, shattered yards, and ripped through rigging. At times, gun smoke swallowed the ships whole, hiding them from each other entirely. Sailors kept hauling fresh charges to the guns without pause. The wounded were carried below, where the ship's surgeons fought to save whoever could still be saved. For many of the American sailors, this was their first real fight against a professional navy, and it turned out to be far harder than the raid on Nassau had ever been. Captain Howe gradually realized the Americans had never managed to form a tight ring around his ship. There were gaps between their vessels. He used exactly those gaps. Catching a favorable wind, the HMS Glasgow abruptly changed course, slipped between the American ships, and made a swift break for open water. Attempts to chase her down went nowhere. The frigate was gone. For the young American squadron, it was a bitter disappointment. It seemed almost unbelievable that a single British ship had managed to escape an entire fleet. But that's exactly what happened. On April 8, 1776, Hopkins's ships sailed into New London, Connecticut, and were welcomed at the docks as conquering heroes. Newspapers ran detailed accounts of the capture of Nassau, the first naval expedition, the first marine landing, the captured cannons, the British governor taken prisoner. For the people of the rebelling colonies, this was the victory they'd been waiting for. It proved the Americans could go on the offensive, not just defend. After months of unsettling news, this was exactly the kind of success the Continental Congress had been hoping for. But the early excitement would soon give way to a far colder assessment. Behind the polished victory lay some serious questions. Why had the Americans let nearly all the gunpowder slip away? Why hadn't they sealed off the harbor mouth? Why had they let the HMS Glasgow escape? These very questions would gradually turn Congress's view of the man who, until recently, had been hailed as the hero of the expedition. The sharpest criticism was aimed at the decision not to block the exit from Nassau Harbor. Many officers would later acknowledge that even a single American ship posted at the harbor mouth would almost certainly have stopped the vessels carrying the British gunpowder. Had that happened, the entire expedition would look very different in the history books. Hopkins defended himself by arguing he'd been operating in a fog of war, without complete information on the enemy's movements. And that was partly fair. He was commanding the first Continental Navy in history, and no one before him had ever conducted an operation of this kind. There were no accumulated lessons to draw on, no proven tactical playbooks. Every decision had to be made from scratch. But in politics, explanations like that rarely save a reputation, especially in wartime. The engagement with HMS Glasgow raised just as many questions. Many congressmen took the view that a superior American force simply had no business letting a single British ship walk away. But that judgment was far too simple. The Continental Navy had only just come into existence, and most of its captains had never before fought in a coordinated squadron action. The crews were still learning to work as a single machine. The signal system was still being figured out, and tactical maneuvers were being drilled in the middle of an actual war. In effect, the battle with the Glasgow was the young American sailors' first real examination. And while they failed to win it, the experience they gained was priceless. Defeats like this one would later push the Americans to rethink officer training, overhaul their signal systems, and pay far greater attention to coordination between ships in battle. Sometimes the most important lessons don't come from victories. They come from your own mistakes. For Essex Hopkins himself, the aftermath of the expedition was deeply mixed. Right after the return, Congress voted him its thanks. Newspapers called him the hero. The public greeted the news of the first successful naval operation with genuine enthusiasm. It looked like a brilliant career lay ahead. But within a few months, the mood had shifted. Every new setback suffered by the Continental Navy brought Nassau back into the conversation. Every time, people remembered the lost gunpowder. They remembered the HMS Glasgow. They remembered the commander's disputed decisions. The criticism grew louder. In the end, political confidence in Hopkins eroded so completely that in 1778, Congress formally removed him from command of the Continental Navy. And so ended the career of the man who had led the first naval expedition of what would become the United States. History dealt with him harshly, but he remains forever a pioneer. Samuel Nicholas's story unfolded very differently. During the Nassau raid, it was his Marines who were first to set foot on enemy shores. It was his men who took Fort Montague, and his men who marched into Nassau. Nicholas would later be recognized as the first commandant of the United States Marine Corps, though in 1776, no one could yet imagine what place that organization would come to occupy in world military history. At the time, it was a small band of volunteers, barely 200 men strong. No glory to their name. No long-standing traditions. No legendary past. All of that was only just beginning to take shape. And the very first page of that story was written on the shores of New Providence. It's worth noting that even back then, the Marines wore a distinctive high leather collar as part of their uniform. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a standard piece of kit, but it had a very practical purpose. The stiff leather protected the neck from glancing saber cuts during boarding actions. It also forced the soldier to keep his head upright at all times, improving posture and bearing on parade. It was precisely because of this detail that Marines began to be called leathernecks. Centuries passed, and the leather collar long ago disappeared from military uniforms. But the nickname survived. Even today, American Marines proudly call themselves leathernecks, a nod to the earliest years of their corps. If you judge the Nassau raid purely by its immediate results, you might conclude the operation was only partially successful. The main objective, securing the gunpowder, was never achieved. The commander made serious mistakes. A British frigate got away. But that kind of assessment only looks at the final tally. And history isn't measured solely by the number of prizes taken. It's measured by consequences. And it was the consequences of the raid that turned out to matter far more than its immediate results. For the first time, the Continental Congress proved it could plan operations far beyond its own shores. For the first time, the young American Navy carried out an independent expedition across open ocean. For the first time, American ships operated as a unified squadron. For the first time, Marines executed an organized amphibious landing. For the first time, the forces of the rebelling colonies seized a British town outside of North America. For a nation that didn't yet officially exist, these were achievements of enormous significance. It was here that the traditions were born that would later become the foundation of American naval power. In the spring of 1776, the men of this expedition had no sense they were destined for the history books. Esek Hopkins never imagined his voyage would one day be studied at naval academies. Samuel Nicholas had no way of knowing his small band of volunteers would become the founding nucleus of one of the most renowned military forces in the world. And the ordinary Marines and sailors were simply following orders, hoping to make it home in one piece. They weren't chasing glory. They weren't trying to be heroes. They had set out to get the gunpowder that George Washington's army so desperately needed. But history has a way of deciding things differently than the people living through it. Sometimes events only reveal their true meaning decades later. That's exactly what happened with the Nassau Raid. By the standards of the War for Independence, this was not the largest operation ever mounted. No armies, thousands strong, clashed on the field. No grand naval battle unfolded. No crushing blow was dealt to the British Empire. The Americans didn't even achieve their primary objective. Nearly the entire gunpowder supply had been moved out of the town just hours before it fell. Any historian judging this expedition purely by its immediate results will inevitably find both genuine successes and serious miscalculations. And they won't be wrong. But sometimes the significance of an event has nothing to do with the number of prizes taken. What truly matters is what begins after it. Perhaps that's exactly why Nassau remains important. Not because of the scale of the fighting, not because of the cannons taken, not because of Essex Hopkins's name, and not even because of the first Marine landing. It remains important because it was here that something became clear for the first time. The rebelling colonies were no longer content to simply defend themselves. They were ready to carry the war onto their enemy's ground. That was a signal heard on both sides of the Atlantic. History tends to remember the great victories, the decisive battles, the names of legendary commanders. But sometimes its course is changed by very different events. A small expedition of a few wooden ships, 200 Marines, one distant island. At first glance, nothing more than a minor episode in a larger war. But it's exactly from episodes like this that great stories are built. Because every tradition begins somewhere. Every great navy once sets out on its first voyage. Every legendary corps once carries out its first landing. The Nassau Raid was exactly that first step for the American Navy and the Marine Corps. In the spring of 1776, none of the men who took part yet understood they were witnessing the birth of a new naval power. But today, 2.5 centuries later, we already know the answer. The history of the United States Marine Corps did not begin with a thunderous victory. It began with the resolve to go where no one had dared to go before. That is exactly why the name of Nassau has never left the history books.